thanks for coming. Today I'm going to talk about filial piety and academic motivation based on a case study I did in South Korea last year. I became interested in this topic last year because mainly of the Tiger Mother issue that came up by Amy Chua. And I was curious, throughout the whole thing, throughout her whole book, a recurring theme that continuously came up was the issue of motivation. What motivates students and what gets them going? At that time, I was teaching in South Korea for 5 years already in international schools. And most of my students were ethnic Korean. They were all high achievers, or at least they all aspired to be high achievers. And I taught IB history and theory of knowledge. So it's kind of like the international equivalent of the American AP curriculum. So in the class, and while teaching them, I became interested in the topic of motivation, and specifically in the East Asian context for Confucian heritage cultures. Myself, being from a Confucian heritage culture, being a second-generation Chinese, my parents are from Hong Kong, I became interested in this topic of filial piety and this pressure that they're consistently under here, and sometimes in situations, people have noted that they've been crushed by this pressure. So filial piety, as the literature I've looked at mostly interprets it as, it's a social cultural value which is tied to people who ascribe to this value, and it's particularly found in Chinese, Korean, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the ethnic Chinese, Southeast Asia, and pretty much around the world. And so examples of this kind of social cultural burden includes, boys having to have male children to carry on the family name, and when your parents get old, you got to take care of your parents, and also, and in order to have the ability to take care of the parents, most oftentimes it's associated with having to achieve academically, so that you have the ability to provide for your parents once they get old. So I began to ask the question, what is the nature of filial piety and the academic motivation of Confucian heritage students at Happy Valley International School? Of course, that's a pseudonym. Is it a positive? Is it a negative? Is it both? And so, while I tried to grapple with this topic, I used primarily two theoretical frameworks, self-determination theory and the dual filial piety model. The self-determination theory has many theories to back it up. Particularly, the basic needs theory is relevant to what I was looking at, which purports that there are three basic nutriments for a person's eudaimonic well-being. Eudaimonia meaning happy, flourishing, and just overall well-being. So the three are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I think those three are pretty self-explanatory. Relatedness is a little more complicated, as I'll get into that later. And that's what, and those three put together form self-determination theory. So that was part of my theoretical framework to understand this. And there's also robust literature to suggest that it is cross-culturally viable. So it's not specific to only in the West, but also in other places of the world. Self-determination theory is relevant as well. With two studies just specifically coming out of Hong Kong that supports that, which I'll talk a little more about later. I also looked at Confucian heritage cultures in relations to academia, and most of the time it's associated with, you all know about here the model minority Asians, how they all have to aspire to get an A+ in the class. A- will get you the lashes. You also have to put in a lot of hard work. Hard work equals success. The home environment is very important. Setting up a quiet environment for children to study, and also parental involvement, being involved in school, sending them to, in the case of South Korea, it'll be hagwons. In other places, it'll be, in Japan, it'll be jukus. In it'll be just tutor centers or whatever they call them there. And of course, there's the filial piety aspect, which I'm looking at as a unique social cultural value in Confucian heritage cultures. The dual filial piety model, which I use, was suggested by Yen Bedford in 2003, which pretty much outlines, creates a matrix looking at reciprocal and reciprocity and authority in the family and how these qualities are negotiated within the family. And so I use this as part of a way of how I understood I approached this question as well. And so I looked at the key motivating factors, what drives students to succeed. I looked at the perceived autonomy, how much autonomy they feel they have, competence, relatedness, relationships with others, and their attitudes towards academic achievement to fulfill filial piety responsibilities as my points of analysis. So the data collection method was through a case study. I did a pilot interview with a couple of people just to tune my interview instrument. Put a survey out just for some demographic data to understand their perspective, and specifically how much Western influence they had. And I'll show that in a little bit. I conducted 8 semi-structured interviews, and also, of course, participant observations since I was there for 5 years. And so these are the participant demographics. Of course, these are all pseudonyms again. And as you can see, they're all 8, and all 8 of them are seniors. All 8 of them placed in pretty prestigious universities in America. They all have high enough GPA to enter a National Honor Society. They're all in the IBDP program, which is rigorous, and also I built a rapport with them for 2 years since these are my students, which I taught for 2 years, and so they were open to me, but of course there were other factors to consider as well when doing academic research. And I want to point your attention specifically to here, the years living in the West, because that was a major consideration that I had while looking at how westernized are these students, and how does that influence filial piety? That was a corollary question that I had to consider while approaching this topic, because filial piety may take on different forms once there are more Western influences. And I'm using East and West loosely because just for the convenience. So my data analysis that uses self-determination theory, the dual filial piety model, and other emergent themes that came up while looking at these themes. I used inter-rater reliability, where I had other people also code the transcripts to see if we see eye to eye on these themes. I left an audit trail, journaling, memos, transcripts. I was cognizant of their participant reactivity. Sometimes the students, at the end of the interview, they'll ask me, "So how did I do, Mr. Tam?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's like a big red flag for getting what you think I want." And of course, I discussed my findings of the CHT colleagues as well for reflexivity. So that's what I came up with. And it looks really complex. It's really not. Up there is autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And what I particularly struggled with is putting together relatedness with filial piety. Now, because filial piety is a social cultural value, at the same time, it's highly based on relationships with your parents and family. And so while using the theoretical framework of self-determination theory, filial piety issues that came up during the coding, I really had to find a way to just put them together, and it almost felt like a separate block within relatedness. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Create a matrix to see which participants responded to different themes that came up, and so on. So what I want to specifically talk about is the filial piety part today, and how it impacts academic motivation. What I found was that all of the high-achieving students that I taught reflected a high reciprocal relationship with their parents. So regardless whether their parents were high authoritarian or low authoritarian, they they had a very strong relationship. And we'll be looking at, and I'll be playing some of their interviews, some sound bites, just so you get a feel of how I put the data together. So, for example, when looking at high authority, this student, Johnny Lee, is what he said.
He was really strict on everything. Mm-hmm. He would during the dinner time, as a kid, of course, I hate onions and all the vegetables. And my dad grew up in a very strict family also. So he wanted me to appreciate what I had, like all the food, and not leave anything. And even if I spit it out of my mouth, he forced me to eat it, because just for me to learn. Yeah. And he was really mean. He was one of the, I feared him more than God.
And the student was very funny, and he was pretty loose with me, and so, and a lot of what he said, and a lot of what other students said also reflected, particularly the high authority students, reflected themes like that. My parents would make me do this. If I don't go to Hagwon, which is the tutor center, I don't dare to imagine what happened. If I talk back, they'll smack me. And so most of them follow along these lines. And that's one of the advantages of being a teacher with a student, because they're pretty open with me, and we've built relationships that go beyond the classroom, and they'll tell me what happens in their daily life and so on. So that's one of the benefits I had as a teacher in getting this data. Now I want to look at a low authority example, but also high reciprocal.
My dad is strict and doesn't talk that much. He's not that outgoing personality, but so that used to make me think that he's strict and authoritative. But as I grew older and as I understand him, or as an adult, not parents, I realized that he's not that authoritative. He also wants the family, me, my brother, and my mom to care for him.
And these accounts also came out in saying that for the low authority students, a lot of them, some of them sounded like it had a lot of Western influences, and where the parents said, "Oh, you can pursue what you want. I'm not gonna force you to do anything," and so on. So I would associate with those with Western things, but then again, it's really hard to say, where these influences come from. For high reciprocity, here's another account.
My dad gives presents. That's how I think he expresses love. My mom. I don't know, just her concern for me, I guess, is an expression of love. Mm-hmm.
Right, and most students were able to say that their parents express love to them, and they all pretty much agree that, yeah, my parents love me, I feel my parents love me, and that's also a recurring theme. So I looked at how they reciprocated. So not only from the parents' perspective, but also from the students. How did the students respond to their parents? And for all of these, I looked at, so there's some type of respect, some type of other ways, some type about, I need to go study hard to get money, so I can get a good job, so I can, get a lot of money to pay for my parents or whatever. But essentially, two things that all the students agreed upon was to love and care parents, show love and care to the parents, and also make the parents happy or proud. And we're going to listen to some of these sound bites as well. So love and care.
Above all, love. Because without love, a relationship is nothing, I believe. Well, there can be like, oh, you're my boss and I'm your worker kind of relationship, but that's another thing. But in people's relationship, I think the major thing to consider is love. And number two is respect towards each other. And I believe that I have a lot of respect for my mom and my dad.
Right. And also making parents happy or proud.
I want to do well because I want to make them proud. So I don't know if that's pressuring me, but so they like discipline me to do better, but it's just that I want to make them proud. I want to make my family proud.
So overall, my findings reviewed that for autonomy, academic competence, relatedness of others, which I didn't really talk about in this presentation, those all factor in. And a real filial piety also showed that, yes, it does impact academic motivation, or at least the students say that filial piety is one of the main factors that impact their academic motivation. But while I was reading through my transcripts and sifting through the data, a lot of my findings show that filial piety really does come secondary to all these other things that come up, and I don't have enough time to show comparatively filial piety is not as important as the other three factors in self-determination theory. But this also corroborates two studies that came out of Hong Kong that looked at high school students and how it showed that filial piety is an academic motivator, but it's less so compared to the other three as well. In my analysis, I found there's a couple of things that I found interesting. Number one was the integration of filial piety values. I found that filial piety, a lot of students were able to align competence, autonomy, and relatedness with filial piety. Meaning, I am achieving because that's what my parents want me to do. My parents want me to achieve my dreams, and therefore I achieve. Right? So it's not because I want to please my parents, it's because my parents want what I want for me to do what I want to do, and therefore I do what I want to do. And so that was an interesting way, a common theme that I found that students were able to align filial piety with these other three academic nutriments, motivators. I also found that parental values and expectations in relation to its role of academic motivation was the importance of high reciprocity. A lot that, once again, their relationship with the parents and the students' relationship worked all very well and seemed pretty healthy, at least from the accounts of the students. But I also found that all four of these elements were all very intertwined complexly, and it's almost like it's difficult to separate from one another. For example, a student would say, being competent will grant them more autonomy, right? Because their parents trust them, and because their parents trust them, there's less conflict at home. So it's almost like a positive cycle. If you're competent, you'll get more freedom, and everything will be good. But I could also see it going the other way, which actually suggests for further studies, which I'll talk about later. So my conclusions for this study really showed that high reciprocity is key if filial piety is to be an academic motivator, and it also showed that so that's my conclusion. High reciprocity is necessary for filial piety to be an academic motivator, and Julia Shin sums it up pretty well.
I myself want to become successful. That's separate from me being sure. That as a daughter, I should care for my mom because she raised me, took care of me. But I have my own dream and I have my own greed.
Okay.
I should say.
So, in order to expand on this study, I would suggest looking at low achieving students. And see whether how does filial piety work for students who are low achieving, and also looking at the Confucian heritage cultures such as China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and maybe more of Korea, and also taking into account that this is an international school. So a lot of students, like I showed you earlier, spent a couple years in the West, and so how about students without Western influence, or how about students with more Western influence? How would that look? And how would that shape filial piety as an academic motivator? So thank you for your attention. That's all I've got. Got any questions? Yeah.
I'm from Korea, as you know. Yeah. As a representative of Korea, South Korea, informal way. I agree. That's very true, perfectly true. But I have two questions. First question is, very true. You heard only one side. Maybe we have to look at the other side of coin. So have you ever tried to hear parent side? Because I'm in the middle of some project, some research. Yeah, I met some Korean student at Penn. Yeah, so at that time I asked them, why did you choose this school, or why did you choose your major? At the time they answered, I didn't choose this school or major. My parents did, because they don't care what major is, what school is. If they enter Ivy League school, their parents are satisfied, something like that. So there's a big tension between parents and children. So we easily can blame parents' side. So I'd like to hear some parents' side.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, because like I said, it's a two-way street between the parents and the students. What the parents does will impact how the students participate, and vice versa. During my time in Korea, I sat as a teacher there. I sat through a number of parent-teacher conferences, so I was able to get a lot of talk to a lot of parents. I did not systematically collect data based on that, because I wasn't thinking of that study during that time. So what I found, yeah, a lot of parents do want their students to go to the Ivy League schools. The whole education desire. I would argue is pretty strong.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to see what parents think of it. It did come up in my data, some of the students' accounts, that my parents wanted me to go into law at this school, and now I'm going to law at this school because of that. So that did come up, yes.
So another question, you already mentioned it. We have to research about some low achiever students. Actually, it's not a question, but I noticed one specific situation. So usually, I'm not a big fan of Amy Chur, but sometimes parents don't know what reality is, so they always push hard their children, regardless of their academic achievement level, their children's level. So that means low achiever students are neglected by their situation. So
yeah, it is a concern, and I think one of the response. Well, when Amy Cho's book came out, I bought it on Amazon on Kindle, and while I was downloading, I saw a lot of other books that suggested readings, and then one of them was called Tiger Mother, Son of a Leap, right? and it's written by this guy who. And it was a free download, so I was like, okay, I'll download it, I'll read it a bit. And it was pretty much the first chapter was, half of it was swearing about how this type of filial piety pressure crushed that student and pretty much destroyed him. And so that's why I said, low achievers definitely. But how about the middle achievers? I didn't write that down, but what's the impact on that? Yeah.
So John, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I think you've given us a lot to think about. So I'm interested a little bit in issues of class, because it seems to me if you have high achieving students going to elite universities with a background in traveling the world, you're basically talking about a highly elite privileged class. And so I'm wondering, for example, how different this would be for a white American, high-achieving, privileged kid. I mean, is this really about Confucian cultural heritage, or is it about class and achievement in school?
Right, and that's actually a common criticism that comes up for people who write about Confucian heritage cultures. I would have to admit that the students that I taught at this international school, their parents were like, chair of Olympus or something like that, they have to fork out around $30,000 a year to attend this international school, and plus the international students fee. So yes, they are definitely from the upper class, and that is an interesting question, which I would be interested to know as well. But from what I've found here is is essentially how a lot of students bring up the account, and it's interesting you bring this up because if we go back to that chart I had earlier, a lot of students bring up the account that they do want to earn money to raise
Above all, love.
hold on. Like for example, money to parents, but that's only 37.5%, and that seems very, I don't want once again I don't want to fall into stereotypes of Asians doing this because it's the Asian thing to do. But also like money to parents is not a very Western thing to do either. I mean, it's hard. I find it hard to escape from these kind of stereotypes as well. But here, a lot of them do ascribe that they're doing this to fulfill filial piety duties. So I'm wondering whether is it an issue of there's a filial piety name, like there's this filial piety thing here, and it's like, okay, that's why I'm doing it. And that's why and then they stick your name tag on it, and it's like, okay, that's why I'm doing it. But in the West, it might be just like loving your parents and reciprocating what they did for their contributions to your education. So that's an interesting question, and I don't have a very good answer for that. But yes.
Thanks. Just to continue with that line, I think it's actually quite interesting that in different cultures, this kind of reproduction and recycling on wealth and privilege, or the lack of, which is the other story, appear to perpetuate over intergenerationally. And it may well be that in different cultures, different labels, but also different processes work to kind of recreate, reproduce, and recycle. So if you take the case in the UK, the word filial piety I don't think has ever occurred. In fact, it's the first time I come across this term in about 10 years. So nobody talks about it in any way, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, at the same time, as you were speaking, it made me wonder, because in the UK, there are lots and lots of people who don't work, in a sense of not in gainful paid employment. They look after their parents. Mm-hmm. What are they doing, these people? Why are they spending time looking after parents and not earning money? Mm-hmm. It's such a widespread phenomenon now because of the, forever lengthening lifespan.
Right.
Lots of people are quite old and in need of help, but they don't have cash or capital to buy. So it falls upon the children, who are themselves probably in the 50s or 60s, sometimes these guys, giving up work. How do we label that? And now the government is beginning to recognize this, and they're beginning to talk in terms of using the welfare state system to, for example, provide some sort of income support for people who have fallen into poverty because they can't work, and yet there isn't enough income, and also to give them some sort of state entitlement for 2 weeks holiday, so that the state will pay for home help, so that they can get away and have a holiday, and things like that. These measures are coming in one way or another, and so there may be something like this kind of filial piety going on, but it's different sort of label.
Right.
At the same time, as you probably know, in Britain, if you come from working class background, chances of your succeeding in education is much less than if you were from a middle class background.
Right.
And yet there's no such thing as you'd be a good boy, girl, or all of this, and yet it's played out, intergenerationally, gone on for 200 years.
Right. Yeah. And so I think even like filial piety, there's many different ways of manifestations that it can take, but when it changes, can you even call it filial piety? That's one of those things where it's at some point it's just a human construct. It's a label that people put on to certain things. And I'm definitely interested to see, for in the case of China, one-child policy, where one child would have to take care of their parents and their two. Essentially, one has to take care of 6. How is that going to play out? in the future, and what's filial piety's role in that? Because seems to be this revival of Confucian values in China right now. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Because I definitely seen some parallels between Chinese culture and Western culture here. So have you guys watched a movie like Dead Poets Society, which talks about approach balance?
What?
Which is
Dead Poets Society.
yeah, which is totally exactly the same. In this elite class, the tension between parents' expectation and the students' so like dream or motivation to pursue their own dreams. So yeah.
Yeah, tension between expectations and aspirations.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Gongsun talking about the intergenerational issues, and I'm kind of interested in individual issue. So within the individual, I mean, among the students that you interview with, did you actually see any changes in their perception, since they are very young to college level at that time, right? So, when they're younger, then they have more pressure, or when they get older, when they become teenagers, and they have more pressure, whatever. I mean, I'm just curious about the changes over time.
Yeah. And that's one of the interesting things in one of the accounts about a girl, that girl to talk about how she thought her dad was really strict when she was younger, but as she grew older, she started understanding my dad's not that strict. He wants to be cared for.
Right.
He's just a little more quiet. And themes like that did come up, but it wasn't the focus of my study. But it did come up where one of my students said that when he was young, he talked back to his dad, and his dad sent a very clear message: you don't mess with me. This is a line you don't cross. Right? But then on good days, his dad will cook with him and talk about cars and talk about anything. He doesn't care if he gets into this is what he said, like approximately verbatim. But my dad doesn't care if I get into UCLA or NYU. We just hang out and talk about cars and stuff. But when he was younger, he sent the message very clearly. So the whole filial piety, how this reciprocity plays, seems to change, when you're younger and older as well. And I think it's also during those parent-teacher conferences, I get these parents which come in and say, "My son is so he talks about your class, and he seems to like you, Mr. Tam, but he talks back to me all the time, and I don't know how to deal with him. He used to be such a nice kid, and then so there's this factor where he's an adolescent, right? like he or she's going through changes, and so there's that aspect as well, yeah. So yes, there's definitely a temporal aspect to this. Sorry, if you and then.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. Very good. But my question is how this filial piety, this notion, I feel can be contested as a Confucian culture heritage, because I feel this. It depends on how you define this term. I feel if you just talk about what they mentioned, love or respect, I feel it can be a pretty good westernized term. Ideology as well at the same time. So yeah, I wonder if you are able to look at like transnational Confucian-related cultures, like what your identity is. Like at the same time, you are pretty influenced by the West idea and also inherit this kind of culture. So I wonder, whether we can really call this as a Confucian culture heritage. And at the same time, I'm being exposed to a lot of like Confucian humanism, which claim Confucius is kind of global ideology, like not really just restricted to China or Asia.
So the whole idea of it, just for right? Like it's like a human is born to be good natured. I mean, there are statements where Confucius makes it's human nature. Some of these things, and these relationships are all based on normal human relationships. And in fact, in the ideal Confucian society, there should be no government because everyone has perfect relationships and it's done properly. But of course, that's not the case. So like I said earlier, like this Confucian heritage culture might just be a construct. Filial piety might just be a construct where people do certain things and they just say this is why I'm doing it. And so I don't really have a good answer for for what you say, because, like I said, while I was trying to code this whole process, I had a hard time separating filial piety from relatedness. And essentially, I have to say, at the end, it's just values that people ascribe to, that are canonized and codified through either culture, heritage, or text.
So do you think this would be one of the reasons you think that filial piety is secondary to other components described by the self-determination theory?
Right. Yeah, quite possibly so. Quite possibly so.
Yes. To go back to the question about intergeneration with the parents and students, you used the example of the student who, when he was younger, his dad was very strict about where you're going to go, what you're going to do, but when he got older, kind of shifted. Do you think can that be attributed to the fact that by the time you get to a certain age, they already drilled that into you, so
yeah.
At some point they don't even have to keep repeating it to you for you to continue that?
Yeah. That could, and that's also another element where it's just they're used to it. The expectations are clear, the lines you don't cross. And he also said, I don't dare to, like, one of my students, Curtis, said, one time I said this to my dad, and he let me know that's wrong, and I'm never going to cross that line again. And so there were lines that, you just don't cross, and expectations that are laid out clearly. But at the same time, Curtis again, he talks about how him and his mom constantly struggle, where his mom is telling him, you need to go to the SAT Hagwon, to get SAT tutoring center, to get SAT help, and do this and do that, and how he's constantly fighting with his mom for his own autonomy. So there seems to be a very, like, the whole adolescent rebellious phase narrative going on as well.
So then, to add to that, do you think gender plays a role? Because I feel like he probably wouldn't have the same relationship with his dad because his dad was very so said it from the get-go. Yeah. You don't cross this line. Yeah. But I'm guessing in this situation that the mom's a little fluid in how she interacts with him and where the line is.
Yeah, and gender is a very interesting question in Korea because gender roles are very defined in Korea. For example, there's this term in Korean called chimakaram, right? Which literally means skirt wind, which it talks about how these moms, these Korean moms, and they run around doing everything to make sure their kids get to the best schools, get their best education, and the wind of their skirt, everyone feels it because it's like they're everywhere kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is that a proper interpretation?
Yeah, Korean society has a strong tendency to link their children's achievement and their parents' social level, especially their mom's social level. So nowadays, I've heard some kind of joke. So usually Korean mom push hard their children, very push hard. But Chinese parents, in China, parents, father and mother, push hard their children. In India, their grandparents and their parents push hard their children.
Right. Right. So yes, gender roles definitely are important, and also like there's also the aspect of once again we're bringing the whole westernization, as these are kids who have been in the West, can go attend a international school in Korea, and in order to do that you actually need to policy changes once in a while, but it generally like 3 years to 5 years in the West with a Western passport, that's a criteria to enter in international school. So how westernized are their parents? And what notions have they picked up on what they perceive to be Western parental values in how to deal with their kids? How much did they pick up? How much of that did they pick up? Which, is another interesting question. So the more I dug into it, the more I realized it's very complex.
I actually see a similar pattern in Africa, but Africa is so broad. So to be more specific, with Nigerian and Ghanaian parents from a specific social class, going back to Alex said, that when I was listening to you, it made me question if this was either Confucianism or because of class, because I see the same thing happening with Nigerian parents and their children, and so is in Ghana too. So.
Right, and that's definitely something that is worth exploring. Any other questions?
It's very interesting presentation because one thing we might need to remember. These informants are really privileged. Their institutions, tuition fees, extremely expensive. Also, usually almost all Korean students are not allowed to enter the school. Yeah, it's very privileged school. But there's some kind of class difference among the students. So it's very important thing, I think. Yeah.
Well, if there's no other questions, thank you for your time, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.